So without further ado, Joan Wagnon.
Thank you. Well, I did not come here tonight to teach a course on tax, so you can relax. I did bring Larry, who is a great practitioner and someone I worked with the whole time I was at the Revenue Department through the Society of CPAs, because I value his opinion, and if you really want to know how pass-through entities work, Larry can explain it in chapter and verse. What I'm here tonight to do is offer an alternative to some of the comments that have been made throughout the state since the legislature passed the tax bill. And somebody asked me, what's its name? Well, it's the Brownback Tax Plan, because it passed in May of 2012. And the governor's been going around the state with his cabinet secretaries talking about how it will bring growth and all that's going to happen. And I'm alarmed about what's going to happen. And so tonight, the conversation needs to be about the consequences of the legislature having adopted that plan. And where do we go? And that's the reason that I asked Bill Hammond if he would come. Because the real beneficiary, if that's not the right word, you can find another, of what's going to happen are our public schools. And I don't think beneficiary is the right word. I think the public schools are going to be harmed by this. So if, with your indulgence, we'll take about 10 minutes and let me just explain briefly what's in the bill, so you'll have some idea what we're talking about. And then Larry and I can answer questions about that. And then I'd like to turn it over to Bill and let him talk about the consequences to public education. Because this program tonight is really not so much about tax as it is about what happens to our economy, what happens to our schools, what happens to our seniors, what happens to our kids if this plan is allowed to stand. Sounds pretty good, you get a tax cut, right? Well, let me tell you, the devil is in these details. I don't have a lot of printed material tonight. I do have a few articles up here that were written by a Kansas State, there's probably not enough to pass out, Johnny, K-State professor, so if anybody wants to read a 10-page treatise, it's up here, and we may have a few more on just some of the numbers that we're using. But the important thing is just to listen and think, and let's get the bill as quickly as we can. So, the Brownback tax plan. You know, so what's the big deal about it? Brownback thinks this is good for the state. He thinks it'll help small business, it'll cut out tax loopholes, it'll simplify the system, it'll flatten the tax code. You hear those words bandied about all of the time, but are they in fact good? The truth is, this is going to help big business. Haven't you heard this called a small business tax cut? Well, it does help some small businesses, but it also helps the coast and some big banks and a lot of different kind of companies. It creates tax breaks and loopholes. It makes it easier to game the system, and it flattens our tax code. And what I mean by that is that the time-honored tradition that we've had about as you become more affluent and able to pay, you pay a larger share than the people who don't have as much money to pay. And so that's the biggest difference here with this. This is what it does. It exempts something called pass-through income, and I'm going to let Larry explain that to you in a little while. But what it is money that is earned by S corporations, partnerships, LLCs, sole proprietorship. So think about the law firm. These people are partners in that law firm. They haven't paid tax on that at all, so their income from that law firm is tax exempt. However, the secretaries who work at that firm are going to pay the tax. It creates two tax brackets, which makes it a little more regressive, but it's not terrible. So we go down to 4.9% in the top bracket and 3% in the bottom bracket. So the truth is everybody's going to get a little piece of the action. every single taxpayer will get a little bit of a deduction or a little bit of relief. The problem is that the relief on the small end and for middle income taxpayers is quite a lot smaller than the relief at the top end. And that's part of what we're talking about. It increases the standard deduction, so if you're married and had a household, you're going to think this is great. But if you're a single guy, and I think there's some single guys, whether you're young or old, you don't get any benefit. It eliminates tax credits. It gets rid of the food sales tax rebate, the child and dependent tax credit. So when they got rid of the loopholes, look at the loopholes they picked. They did not get rid of lots of corporate deductions. They didn't get rid of anything like that. They got rid of things that affect poor people. And they got rid of the homestead property tax refund for renters. And they got rid of, I see my friend in the back, we worked on adoption for all these years through Catholic Social Services, and guess what they got rid of? The adoption tax credit. And what takes more of your money than an adoption at that point? We don't provide any food sales tax assistance in Kansas, and now there are only 2 other states, Alabama and Mississippi, that are in that situation. So that's kind of a fast run through. But this is what gets my attention. And this is what's in the press kits. Every year we calculate a state ending fund balance. That's how much money you have left. You know what it is. It's the amount in your checkbook at the end of the month or the end of the year. Our balances were climbing for a while until 2008, and that's when we had the big drop in the stock market, and that's the year following that where the recession was. So we had a real drop in balances, and we got down to practically nothing. So these 2 years were terrible. Governor Parkinson actually got a penny sales tax through the legislature. It was supposed to go off in 3 years. Remember that? And so in 2013, it's supposed to go back down. So the balances started going up, and it looked like we were on the road to recovery, and then they passed the governor's tax plan. This is what will happen with the Brownback tax plan. It started being implemented in this fiscal year, 2013. By 2014, all of the tax provisions kick in. By 2015, it goes down and down and down and down. And the fallacy in that is that it can't go down because we have a balanced budget amendment in Kansas. So you can't let your balance go below. We don't print money in Kansas. So what's going to happen? We have this first deficit of $261 million. The next year it's $900 million, then 1.47, and then 1.92 billion. And by 5 years out, 2018, it's 2.4 billion. So we can't have a deficit. So the other word for that is we have to balance the budget, and that means we're either going to raise revenues or we're going to make cuts, and the cuts are going to have to be made. And if you think about where Kansas spends its money, more than half of our expenditures out of general fund are going into public education. It's even larger if you add post-secondary education to it. And it's going into education, healthcare, transportation. We're already taking some sales tax money and putting it into the highway plan. We sat on the highway. We came over on 50 tonight, and they were just out there working away on that highway, getting it all fixed up so you can drive safely. Well, that isn't going to happen under this if this plan stays in place, and public safety will be impacted. This tax plan that was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor over 5 years will create a $2.4 billion deficit or shortfall, or whatever you want to call it, or result in $2.4 billion in cuts. It's the only way it can work. Kind of takes your breath away, doesn't it? That much. So who are the winners and losers? The people who are in those 191,000 businesses that are LLCs, that's just a limited liability company. It means that you don't, I'll let Larry talk about it in a minute, but they're not going to pay any income tax in the state. The losers are people with a paycheck. Just folks with a paycheck. Working parents, fixed income Kansas, children awaiting adoption, renters. So the have-nots are going to pay the freight for the haves. And don't let anybody sell you a bill of goods that this is a small business bill, because it is not. There are 25 LLCs that are associated with Koch Industries. You can go and look up each and every one of them. They're now not going to have to pass through that income to anybody. There are banks that are like LLCs. I was at the Hutch News today right after lunch, and they were telling me they're an S corporation, so their shareholders are not going to have to pay any income. And he said, well, what about our shareholders in Missouri? Well, then they'll get, they won't have a credit, so we're going to lose their income here, and we've given a tax break and exported that to Missouri. So there are a lot of mistakes about what have been put into this, but 42% of all this pass-through profits are earned by businesses with more than $10 million in annual receipts. I'm going to slip through some of these. This is basically who's going to get the benefit. This is what we're going to cut: education, transportation. We'll end up losing jobs, and local governments down here are not going to have any assistance from the state, and you're going to see them raising property taxes in order to fund their services. Now, this is not a scare tactic. The governor thinks this will help us grow jobs. He says it will grow jobs. He said it will give us 23,000 new jobs. This is the figure that was calculated by the Kansas Legislative Research Department as the number of jobs that would be required to cover that shortfall of $2.4 billion. You see those two numbers? We get this many, it takes this many. By 2014, we're going to be in the hole, not only the money, but we won't have 400,000 jobs. That's what it would take to make this work. So alternatives that I think are important are for us to restore the funding to education. There's a 12.5% amount that we are down since 2008. You can see the bar charts over here, how it's been cut. I've got real numbers. If you want to look at those, we can. I mean, 3.5% is what we would have to make up for the cuts we've already made. You tell me when you saw that chart where it plunges, if you think this plan will allow us to make up those cuts. We just can't do it. So we've tried to target some property tax relief. That's what Democrats are talking about. We have more of a property tax problem than we've ever had an income tax problem. Our property taxes have gone up 65%. We need to get Kansans back to work. This plan doesn't reward people that create jobs. So these 191 corporations get these tax breaks. Do you think they're going to go out and just hire people? Or do you think they're going to take a cruise? People hire folks when they have products that they need to sell and services that they can provide, not just because they got a tax break. So I just wanted you to know that it's not just my folks. There are all kinds of tax experts and people in the media that have been opposing this plan. There are lots of writings. I try to go with some of the people that, like Martin Dickinson, did a program with us. He's a law professor at KU talking about the problems with this. There was a recent article by Ed Flingy in the Hutch News that the newspapers are saying this bill will be a disaster. The beneficiaries will be the wealthy, and and even Republicans are coming out saying this will bankrupt our state. Rochelle, Ron, do you remember Rochelle Cronister?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Rochelle says this experiment will bankrupt our state and create a $2.7 billion deficit in 5 years. She is a former Republican House of Representatives member, a former state Republican Party chair, and she's now having a group called Traditional Republicans for Common Sense that are trying to get people to wake up. This is not about playing politics. This is about protecting our lives, our families, our schools, and things that are important.